Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. Last time, we did an all-too-quick overview of Egyptian civilization and started to get to know Thutmose III, widely considered to be the greatest pharaoh in Egyptian's absurdly long history. But we left off by teasing that just after taking over as sole ruler, Thutmose III had to stare down his first crisis of leadership. You know, now that his stepmom and co-pharaoh Hatshepsut had died and left him solely in charge at the tender age of 21. He'd had a long apprenticeship under the regency of Hatshepsut and had slowly learned the ins and outs of military strategy and tactics. By the time he assumed his role as sole pharaoh, he was supremely in command of Egypt's army. Now, if you haven't listened to part 1, it might be worth going back for a listen. I'll give you a second. All right. If you're still there, and where were we? Right. Thutmose is the man, solely in control. No meddlesome stepmom around with whom he had to share power. But he didn't have long to settle into his role before he was put to the test. Early in his reign, Thutmose faced a big crisis. Up in their homeland, the Canaanites, a people arrayed across what is roughly modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, rose up in revolt to test the mettle of the new king. It's quite possible that the Canaanites were the source of the Hyksos quote-unquote invasion discussed in the prior episode. A rebellion of this kind was not uncommon. Changes in leadership often brought forth challenges to authority, especially by people resentful of foreign dominion. The Canaanites had long been under Egyptian hegemony, and Thutmose I, founder of the 18th dynasty, was particularly effective at ensuring that they stayed under the Egyptian yoke. But there was a new king on the throne, and he was young indeed. Succession, even uncontested succession, can lead to uncertainty and instability, or even just distraction, and it can create an opportunity for a repressed or domineered people to rise up in pursuit of their independence. It was precisely this kind of challenge to empirical rule that led to the downfall of the Akkadians at the hands of those pesky and independent-minded Sumerians discussed in the very first episode. Such rebellions with transition in leadership might not have been uncommon, but Thutmose was not a common pharaoh. He was strong-willed and determined. He'd also been chafing under the regency of Hatshepsut, his prodigious energy in need of an outlet. Now that he had the big job all by himself, he wasn't going to let some rebel Canaanites throw him off course. For him, their rebellion was not a crisis, but an opportunity to jump into the fray. Remember, Thutmose was newly enshrined as the sole ruler of Egypt, but that didn't mean that he was inexperienced. He might have been the junior partner to Hatshepsut, but he was the senior commander of the Egyptian military. He was an experienced general and leader, even at such a young age. The Canaanites were testing the mettle of someone who had been groomed for leadership from the day he was born, and it was time to show those feisty Canaanites who they were rebelling against. He rapidly mustered his army and marched it north at a blistering clip, as fast as an ancient army could move, that is. It's amazing to consider that until the advent of the railroad, no army was faster than their slowest foot soldiers. But for Thutmose, those soldiers hustled, and he brought his forces within striking distance of his belligerents in 20 short days. As he closed with his enemy, Thutmose stopped and called a council of war. He and his generals debated the best route to confront the enemy, amassed at the city of Megiddo. From his camp, there were 3 routes to Megiddo. The northern and southern routes were less direct, but were safer, offering more protection from ambushes and a wider path through which to move his forces. The central route was the shortest and most direct, but would leave the army exposed, vulnerable to ambush. Among other drawbacks, the central route was narrow, so narrow that his massive army would practically have to march single file, making them easy targets for archers and rock slingers. Also, going through a pass one by one would take a lot longer than if the army could move through en masse. The central route, in short, could be suicide. For their part, the Canaanites did not have the manpower to fortify all 3 routes. The Canaanites knew Thutmose was coming, but which route would he choose? And how should they deploy their troops to oppose Thutmose's approach to Megiddo? Thutmose listened as his generals argued for the safer but less direct routes. After listening to their arguments, Thutmose rejected both options and chose the central, more direct route to his enemy's doorstep. He chose this route because it was the most vulnerable, reasoning that his enemies would assume that he wouldn't choose it, and they would deploy their troops in the northern and southern routes. He also understood that battle in the open was strongly preferable to a long siege against an opponent huddled up behind city walls. He had to get to Megiddo fast. Speed over safety, the potential for surprise over the impulse for security. Bet right, and the reward could be significant. Bet wrong, and Egypt is on the market for a new pharaoh to take the place of the dead guy up in Canaan. One can only wonder what his older general thoughts of their king's bold move. Thutmose's judgment and the decision to overrule his generals proved to be spot on. Assuming that he would take one of the safer routes, the Canaanites chose to contest the northern and southern passes, and as such, Thutmose's army faced little opposition on their march to Megiddo. What few enemy soldiers they encountered were scattered with ease, and Thutmose closed the gap with his enemies with lightning speed. The Canaanites had little time to organize their forces. Thutmose had caught them unprepared and outside the city walls of Megiddo. The outcome was little in doubt. Thutmose annihilated his enemies in open battle. A few survivors managed to limp into the city and offer token resistance, but in short order, Megiddo fell, and with it, the entire Canaanite resistance. They'd made their bid for independence on the assumption that the young pharaoh would equivocate or struggle to assert himself. The young king had more than responded to the challenge. Rather than gaining freedom from Egyptian hegemony, the Canaanites put themselves further under the yoke. Their rebellion, started to test Thutmose and to gain freedom, was utterly crushed and only deepened their subservience to their Egyptian neighbor. Consider for a moment what this represented for Thutmose. He'd studied warfare and campaigned with the army for most of the regency and co-rule period with Hatshepsut. But this was his first command as pharaoh, and his generals were seasoned and battle-tested. They urged caution, a safer but more methodical approach to engaging their adversary. It would have been so easy for him to follow their example, to question his own judgment, letting the combined weight of several older, experienced officers outweigh his own assessment. Risk aversion is a natural tendency. He had a lot on the line. But he had a keen insight into the nature of his enemy, correctly understood how they would defend themselves, and possessed unshakable conviction in both his strategic vision and his leadership. He marched to victory and to glory. If at this point you're wondering why the name Megiddo sounds vaguely familiar, that's because in about 15 centuries, Megiddo will enter the Christian apocalyptic scripture as the site of the final battle between the forces of good and evil, Armageddon. But the looming end of the world as we knew it little bothered Thutmose. He felt fine. Taking Megiddo did more than snuff out the resistance of a pesky upstart. The city was tied into several important trade routes. An uncontested possession of the city created a new wave of economic activity for the burgeoning Egyptian empire. After Megiddo, Thutmose returned triumphantly to Egypt. We know a lot about the battle, or at least Thutmose's version of events, because he proceeded to carve inscriptions and erect monuments proclaiming his accomplishments and boasting of his military prowess. So far as can be told, the accounts of the Battle of Megiddo provide the oldest description of any battle in history. It goes without saying that humans had been building armies and marching them against one another for millennia. But Thutmose's inscriptions about his stirring victory at Megiddo give us the first specific accounts of one such occurrence, the first description of specific events, the first discussion of tactics and strategy. For this reason, Megiddo is often called the first battle ever recorded. Unlike some of his successors, including the subject of the next episode, Thutmose's claim of dramatic and total victory seemed to be accurate, more than simply feel-good propaganda. Megiddo was his first campaign as pharaoh, but it sure wasn't his last, because Thutmose enjoyed campaigning and he knew he was good at it. Really, really ridiculously good at it. For the majority of his sole rule, he led his armies, year after year, battle after battle, campaign after campaign. In surviving inscriptions, he is recorded as having personally led numerous major campaigns and several lesser ones. He was a king for a very long time, 20 years as co-pharaoh to Hatshepsut, and another 34 as sole ruler or senior partner to his son and successor. Until almost the end, you could find him at the head of his army, building, then expanding what is described as the first true Egyptian empire. Now, I don't know about you, but to me this is fairly remarkable. The kingdom was wealthy and powerful. Foreign rulers from lands far and wide sent him gifts and tributes. The economy prospered. Had he been so inclined, he could have luxuriated in his palaces, resplendent as a god king, and enjoyed the trappings of being the most powerful and richest person on the planet. But he didn't. He just kept fighting. He was a brawler, and he was unbeatable. Some of the campaigns that Thutmose conducted were essentially victory tours. Many kingdoms and cities were too smart to resist the juggernaut of his army. He paraded his troops here and there, and when he showed up, the smart people gave up the goods without a fight. Just marching around the Near East, Thutmose enjoyed collecting tribute, gathering up booty, and taking hostages from royal families to ensure their good behavior after he left town. Some resisted. This was always a bad decision. They chose poorly. When met with any resistance, Thutmose was decisive and brutal. He captured and often recaptured cities far from home. For example, he spent considerable time campaigning in what is now Syria. Now, it's unclear if his goal was to expand the Egyptian empire or to go out a ransacking for its own sake, with the resultant empire a byproduct. Either way, year after year, campaign after campaign, he marched off in pursuit of yet more victories, yet more treasure, yet more glory. When we met the Akkadians and the Sumerians in the Sargon the Great episode, we talked about the difference between independent city-states that shared a common cultural affiliation and an integrated polity unified under a sole ruler. Thutmose's conquests tended to take on city after city, rather than all-out wars with fellow superpowers. For the cities, this meant that each one had to fight the mighty pharaoh all on their own, and this came with the inability to pool resources effectively. But for Thutmose, it meant that more often than not, he had to take on one city after another, and he couldn't just line up his army and go toe-to-toe against a massed opponent and slug it out for ultimate supremacy. Conquering cities could be difficult and costly, with the possibility of starvation and disease facing an invading army, especially if the conflict resulted in long sieges outside of city walls. And yet, campaign after campaign, year after year, city after city, Thutmose emerged supreme. His inscriptions claim that he subdued 350 cities across his campaigns. There's always a little bit of room for embellishment in imperial proclamations, but there doesn't seem to be any good reasons to suggest that this number is wildly inflated, especially given that many chose to buy peace through tribute rather than confront Thutmose in war. For the leaders of any such city, I suspect that having Thutmose knock on your door had a way of clarifying your decision-making. The cities fell by the hundreds, and oh, did the money pour in. Campaigning created wealth for Thutmose and the Egyptian Empire in three ways. The first was simply booty seized in conquest. The second was gifts and tributes that foreign kingdoms and cities sent to Thutmose as an acknowledgement of his dominion, such as weapons and horses and chariots and precious metals and armor. Also among the prized treasure was wood. The arid climate of Egypt meant that timber was always in short supply, and access to this precious material for boats, roofs, spear shafts, and other uses was always highly prized. The third was the economic output of the provinces and territories set up by Egypt. The products of these regions created wealth, materials, and produce that could be sent back to Egypt. These included honey, incense, fruit, and olive oil. Thutmose's campaigning extended Egyptian hegemony, asserting his power and overawing peoples and cultures far and wide. For a country with a long, long history of prosperity, Thutmose pushed this threshold even higher. Goods and wealth poured into Egypt. At the same time, by claiming, either through conquest or acceptance of tribute, weapons of war, especially horses and chariots, Egypt was removing from territories material that could be used against them in a future conflict or rebellion. Egypt grew stronger, while at the same time the vanquished or subservient cities became all the less so. Historically, there was a downside to a powerful army. In antiquity, when an army sacked an enemy city, they would generally strip it of all objects of movable wealth, often including the people themselves. This enriched the commander, in this case the king, and often made soldiers enormously wealthy. But when troops got the taste of spoils, they tended to want more. Eventually, a leader had to either try to call a halt to such pillaging and face a restive army, or keep sending the troops over the next set of city walls to let them slake their lust for booty. In other words, armies that grew rich tended to want more, and a commander could lose control quickly if he tried to check their self-enrichment. Plenty of generals and commanders had been murdered or ousted by their own troops for trying to rein in their avarice. There is no indication that Thutmose ever faced this challenge. In fact, he appears to have been supremely in command of his forces in a way not seen often in history. He genuinely seems to have been driven to flatten all resistance, and his armies were there with him every step of the way. They stayed unquestionably loyal, maintaining the utmost respect for the chain of command and supremely confident in the strategic vision of their pharaoh. Granted, the prime source we have for Thutmose's campaigns are the decrees of Thutmose himself, but it's hard to imagine his ability to take the army out in the field year after year, decade after decade, if he had to simultaneously put down mutinies or mollify restive troops. The picture of his command is one of his army acting as an extension of his will. In many cases, the object of the conquest was conquest itself. Glory for the king, riches for the kingdom. He was really good at campaigning. Scholars seem to consider him to be a military genius, one of the foremost of all people for all time, and the greatest warrior king in Egypt's long history. But that doesn't mean everyone willingly submitted to his advancing armies. Those cities, stubborn or dumb enough to resist, suffered the consequences. Resistance to Thutmose almost always yielded total defeat and the sacking and pillaging of cities. But Egypt was by no means the only powerful kingdom of the ancient world. Thutmose's Egypt had counterparts in, say, the Hittites and the Assyrians. But game knew game, and more often than not, foreign kings conveyed their respect for Thutmose both in words and what he really valued, gifts. They backed up their flattery with cold hard cash, or war horses, or honey, or whatever would keep his juggernaut army focused on other priorities. Thutmose's military was, in a way, one of the most powerful wealth generators in human history. Other kingdoms in the broader region, such as the Hittites and Assyrians, saw this power and bowed down before it, at least at first. It was much easier to send Thutmose a few gifts and acknowledge his supremacy than it was to face the wrath of his highly honed military juggernaut. For a time, only one group was a persistent thorn in the side of the swashbuckling Thutmose. The Mitanni just refused to give in. Mitanni culture is among those we know of more from the records of people they encountered than from their own words. From those records, it is evident that they were strong, fierce, and expansionist, and not at all inclined to be cowed by the Egyptians in general or Thutmose in particular. The Mitanni hailed from the area in the upper region of the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. If you just heard that and wondered, man, how many different civilizations did this area produce? The answer is a lot. And if you're wondering if this is the last one we will encounter, nope, we haven't come close to the Babylonians yet, and we've only hinted at the Assyrians. And they're both a lot of fun. We'll get there in good time. But I digress. The Mitanni were led by a warrior class and, like the Egyptians, had learned and mastered the tactics of chariot warfare. Likewise, the Mitanni were bent on expanding their territory, increasing their power, glorifying their rulers, and generally doing all the same stuff that Thutmose was up to. And why should he have all the fun? The two cultures conquered their way toward one another, and in time, the Mitanni's attempt to expand their territory westward brought them into conflict with Egypt as they moved north and east. The region was not big enough for the two of them. Clash was inevitable, and for once, it wasn't so easy for Thutmose to just brush this adversary aside. The armies bumped into one another. Petty skirmishes escalated into warfare. This time, not just an army against a city, as had so often been the case for the pharaoh, but two civilizations, each drawing on a considerable pool of resources, refusing to give in to the other, determined to go toe-to-toe. As the conflict with the Mitanni escalated, Thutmose made yet another in his long series of innovations. Egyptian expansion had pushed their boundaries north to the Lebanese coast and then inland to Syria. This extended their supply lines to a considerable degree, which, in turn, threatened to leave them vulnerable to isolation. Backed up by the mighty rivers, the Mitanni could potentially move men and materiel with greater rapidity. For Thutmose, if his vital link to his resource base or supplies were cut or overrun, he could be trapped deeply inland and suddenly vulnerable. At the same time, he needed to rise to the Mitanni challenge, and he couldn't allow them to entrench themselves in the contested territory. Any delay would give them more time to dig in, to choose the field of battle, to shift the conflict to their advantage. Thutmose was caught once again with the dilemma of move fast and be bold, or be cautious and risk the consequences. In weighing up what to do, Thutmose realized that he needed to dramatically change his thinking on logistics. He understood that the conflict with Mitanni would be greatly aided by the integration of land and sea forces. As such, Thutmose had the vision to deploy a powerful navy to augment his army. The navy could facilitate the moving of goods and materiel, keep his field armies well supplied, even far from home and deep inland. There was only one problem with his plan. Egypt didn't have a navy. No one did. The Egyptians had merchant ships, but nothing that lined up with what Thutmose had in mind. Convinced of his vision, Thutmose channeled significant resources into building a navy from scratch and with lightning speed. Personally, I think having the vision to invent a whole new way of fighting and supplying an army is a pretty impressive feat. Historians tend to agree, as Thutmose's founding, building, and deployment of the Egyptian navy is hailed as the creation of the first combat navy in all of human history. So I guess in addition to being a great general, we should also call him an admiral as well. He didn't just found the Egyptian navy, he essentially founded all of them. At first, the conflict between the two powers was as lopsided as all contests with Thutmose seemed to be. His strategy was cunning. He allowed the Mitanni to underestimate him. This is quite an accomplishment, given Thutmose's formidable reputation, but he tried to appear as though he was just out on another half-hearted campaign of plunder and tribute and payments, not really committed to a serious fight. He wanted the Mitanni to consider that maybe the pharaoh had gone soft, and he was only interested in treasure. Thutmose presented a vision of himself that aligned with how the Mitanni wanted to see him. It was a ruse. Thutmose lulled the Mitanni to sleep, feigning a leisurely campaign up the Lebanese coast, showing all signs that he was out on another victory lap. Just when his adversary let their guard down, Thutmose switched into gear, turned to the right, pivoted inland, and led a lightning raid across the Euphrates, supplied by the sea bases in his newly minted navy. The Mitanni had little time to organize a resistance, and Thutmose overran their territory with ease. On a long-ago campaign, his grandfather, Thutmose I, had erected a commemorative stele at the Euphrates. To honor his own accomplishment, Thutmose III did the same, carving his record of conquest into stone for any would-be resistors to see and to remember. For Thutmose, it appeared that the fight with the Mitanni was another day, another conquest. But if Thutmose assumed that this conquest would reduce the Mitanni to groveling for mercy, the kind exemplified by their neighbors, then he didn't know his adversary. The Mitanni, it would seem, had a backbone. With some time to regroup, the Mitanni king raised and trained a new and formidable army. You may recall that they were equally skilled in chariot warfare, something that Thutmose usually enjoyed as a battlefield advantage against his adversaries. When the Mitanni took their reconstituted forces into the field against Thutmose, the result was much more even than Thutmose was used to. The evidence suggests that, perhaps for the first time, Thutmose had met his match. Or, at least, it might be better said that it was much less of a blowout than normal. The Egyptians eventually won a hard-fought contest, subdued the Mitanni, and forged an exhausted peace. He clearly respected his adversary, as events would soon demonstrate. Still, that didn't stop him from commissioning more inscriptions proclaiming his overwhelming success. Regardless of the truth of his claims, his nimble and adaptable mind saw another threat. In what is now central Turkey, the Hittite Empire was growing stronger and bolder. The Hittites were another of the Bronze Age civilizations that were based on the kind of royal prestige that only comes with military aggression. They were fierce and expansionist, and none too pleased that Thutmose was rambling around in their backyard, conquering cities that they felt were theirs to do with as they pleased. Plus, they had grown tired of buying peace with tribute payments and flattering words. For Thutmose, the peace with Mitanni came at a good time. There was only so far Thutmose could march his armies without overextending himself, navy or no navy, and the saber-rattling Hittite needed to be dealt with, and fast. They could easily sweep down from Anatolia and come crashing into his hard-won and lucrative northeast territories. He needed a check on their rising power. For their part, the Mitanni didn't want to be caught with hostile enemies to both their north and their south. They were caught in the middle. Despite their simmering animosity toward one another, Thutmose understood that both sides had an incentive to curb Hittite ascendancy. In this case, and despite their hard-fought war, they actually needed each other. In an act of remarkable statesmanship, Thutmose reconciled with his foe, and together Egypt and Mitanni formed an anti-Hittite alliance. This shows Thutmose to be more than just a rough-hewn conqueror. By switching the Mitanni from adversary to accomplice, he demonstrated a shrewd mind for geopolitics, and in the process insulated his empire against a burgeoning power. The Mitanni shared an extensive border with the Hittites, and if things went sour between Egypt and the Mitanni on one side and the Hittites on the other, then the Mitanni would bear the brunt of the initial conflict. Thutmose had more to gain from this alliance than he had to lose. Now, this alliance would have mixed results over time. In a couple generations, the daughter of a Mitanni king would become the wife of the pharaoh Amenhotep III. But tempers would flare up from time to time, and the alliance was always shaky. For example, toward the end of his rule, Thutmose would again confront and get the better of the Mitanni when they sought to erode Egyptian hegemony by stirring up rebellion in Syrian cities. Still, despite the complex future that lay ahead for the parties, Thutmose quieted a consistent problem and turned it to his advantage. The Hittites are another civilization about which next to nothing was known for a long, long time, and only recently has their scope and influence begun to be understood. But having just mentioned them briefly here, we will have to get into more detail in our next episode, so we'll save a bit more about them for the next time. Consider these last few minutes as a brief teaser. Part of the reason we can breeze past the Hittites right now is because Thutmose's strategy proved to be effective. While his successors would have to confront the Hittites, the alliance with the Mitanni removed them as an effective threat for the balance of his reign. A sustained peace, or at least the prevention of conflict, with the Hittites was itself quite an accomplishment. Now, just as Egyptian history is divided up into dynasties, so too is the reign of Thutmose divided up into his campaigns. It's a dating convention that helps to keep all of his wars and conquests straight from one another. His war with Mitanni, referenced a few moments ago, for example, was in his 8th campaign. Toward the end of his rule, and thus life, Thutmose embarked on yet another campaign, this one his 17th. But rather than take the army north, as he had done so many times previous, he instead, and apparently for the first time, pointed his troops south. In Upper Egypt, the smooth flow of the Nile is broken up by stretches of boulders, rapids, and unnavigable shallow waters. These are called cataracts, and the further south you go, the more you encounter. Near the first cataract, Egypt's borders to the south brought them in contact with another deeply ancient people, the Kushites. The people of Kush, or often referred to as Nubia, had their own complex, sophisticated, and well-developed civilization. In time, they would even build 200 or so of their own pyramids, many of which can still be seen to this day. Roughly corresponding to modern northern Sudan and Ethiopia, the Kushites tended to lean on the cataract of the Nile as a buffer from their northern neighbors, and vice versa. Thutmose, ever the inveterate empire builder, saw the riches of Kush and with them the chance to expand his kingdom and, as always, enrich himself. He marched his army south in his 50th regnal year and advanced deep into Kush to the 4th cataract of the Nile. True to form, Thutmose did what he always did, vanquishing all that came before him and pushing the borders of Egyptian dominion even further. This was as far as any Egyptian army had advanced. This campaign edged the borders of the empire to their largest extent, both under Thutmose and for all time. After his Kushite conquest, the Egyptian army stretched south into Lower Kush, all the way into Mesopotamia. Considering the state of the Egyptian kingdom at the start of the 18th dynasty, when Egypt was cleaved in two and the Hyksos were running the show in Lower Egypt, Thutmose completed a remarkable turn of fortune and brought Egypt to its greatest heights of power. It's worth emphasizing this point. In Egypt's long history, it was under Thutmose III and after his 17th campaign that the Egyptian empire reached its zenith, its high water mark, so to speak, an apt metaphor given that all of it flowed from the Nile. Now this was to be the last campaign of the mighty Thutmose III. After the campaign into Kush, the pharaoh had been on the throne for more than 50 years and more than 30 on his own. God king though he may have been, he knew he couldn't live forever, at least not in the temporal realm. By all accounts, he had already lived longer than most, and by a far margin. The average rule of an 18th dynasty pharaoh was about 17 years, and Thutmose had been at it for more than 3 times that long. He had been predeceased by his son and intended successor, Amenemhat, born of his great royal wife. Succession thus fell to his next oldest son, Amenhotep II, born to one of his lesser wives. Incidentally, Thutmose had at least 7 wives, and with them 8 children. Following his Nubian campaign, Thutmose elevated his young son Amenhotep to be his co-pharaoh. The two would share the throne, much as Thutmose and his stepmother Hatshepsut had done 3 decades previously. Prior to his accession, Amenhotep had been following in Dad's footsteps, training with the army, cultivating his physical prowess, and preparing to lead. His time would come quickly, because in about 2 years, the great warrior king Thutmose made his transition to the afterlife, somewhere between 54 and 56 years old. Unlike Dad, Amenhotep II didn't have to chafe under a regency. At 18 years old, when Thutmose died, he was able to rule fully on his own. Thutmose III was interred in the Valley of the Kings, in an elaborate rock-cut tomb. His mummy went through its own trials and tribulations, his tomb having been plundered in antiquity and his corpse removed and dumped in a big cache of mummies, stripped of anything valuable and tossed together in a big pile. In fact, more than 50 kings and queens, plus other royals and nobles, would find their way into what is now called the royal cache, and there they stayed, unceremoniously tossed together, denied their eternal rest, all mixed up, for nearly 3,000 years, when in 1860 locals made the first discovery. Here's hoping that Thutmose and all the rest were able to make their transition to the afterlife before suffering this earthly indignity. You can still visit Thutmose III, though. His mummy, damaged though as it was, is at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. If that's a bit too far afield, you can visit some of his obelisks in places like Central Park in New York or the Thames Embankment in London, where they go by the completely misleading name of Cleopatra's Needle. At his death, and ever since, Thutmose has been hailed as Egypt's greatest pharaoh. Was he? This one seems easy enough to answer. Thutmose III is widely considered to be a military genius, one of the greatest commanders in human history. One famous Egyptologist called him Egypt's Napoleon. That's unfair to Thutmose, I think. Napoleon was certainly an accomplished strategist, but he also lost here and there, including at the famous Battle of Waterloo. He ended his life in exile, and by many utterly reviled. Thutmose, it should be noted, might have had some thorny engagements, but he does not appear to have been ever defeated in battle. Not once. And he campaigned far, far longer than the little general. Oh no. I hope I haven't offended France with that epithet. Well, if it helps France, Napoleon was actually like 5'6", which would have made him much, well, slightly taller than average for his time and day. But his stature cannot compare with Thutmose III. Nor, for that matter, can many people at all. Thutmose was innovative, cunning, and decisive. He developed new tactics, founded the Egyptian navy, and used it to great effect. For most of its history, Egypt was a kingdom. Under Thutmose III, it was an empire, a far-ranging, multi-ethnic, economically, socially, and artistically diverse polity. There's something to be said for a ruler who pushes one of human history's greatest civilizations to its greatest extent. For, while he achieved great military success, his rule also witnessed economic prosperity, a surge in public building, religious innovation, and diplomatic success. Like Sargon, our feature in episode 1, Thutmose tended to let conquered cities that submitted to his rule live in peace, so long as that tribute poured in. All in all, he seems to have lived up to his lofty reputation. He's not the most famous pharaoh, not by a long stretch. That's our next episode. But he does seem to have been the greatest. At the end of the last episode, I previewed that Thutmose would seek to eradicate Hatshepsut from the collective memory. Despite the fact that they peacefully co-ruled for 2 decades and that, by all accounts, she was a gifted, just, and competent pharaoh. Thutmose seemed bent on vanquishing his stepmom, even if it came after her death. What does the destruction of Hatshepsut's statues and inscriptions say about Thutmose and his legacy? For a long time, historians believe that the iconoclasm that Thutmose conducted on his stepmom statues was evidence of a feud between the two. The theory went that he must have been resentful of sharing the throne that should have been, by rights, solely his. As co-pharaohs, Thutmose appears alongside Hatshepsut on many monuments and inscriptions. The Vandals left his image intact, only defacing hers. This is used as evidence to support the "this guy really didn't like his stepmom" theory, and portrays Thutmose as harboring long, simmering animosity. It conveys a brooding and vengeful temperament. After all, why else would he order the destruction of such magnificent works of art and sculpture? This also hints that perhaps Hatshepsut herself was beneath the dignity of rule. She must have done something to warrant such wrath, right? Fortunately for both, these ideas have come under close scrutiny. It appears that the damage to Hatshepsut's statuary and inscriptions date to the very end of Thutmose's reign, corresponding to the time that he appointed his son and successor Amenhotep as his co-ruler. This has a few important implications. For one, if their feud was so intense, why wouldn't he have carved her image out of the record immediately upon assuming sole rule? For that matter, if there were such rivals, then why would she have put him in the position to challenge her authority by giving him the keys to the military? After all, even if he wasn't old enough to command the army during his regency, he would have been able to become close to those that did. And the last thing a pharaoh would want is to have the military in opposition. It doesn't quite add up that Thutmose vented his hatred on Hatshepsut after she died by destroying her imagery 3 decades later. But something drove him to act. What was it? It seems more likely that the vandalism was a measured act, less about removing Hatshepsut from the record as entering Amenhotep II into it, elevating the young pharaoh to a position of equality to his father. Thutmose wanted the people to see his son as his equal, his co-ruler. As her imagery falls away, Amenhotep makes his appearance. Hatshepsut was more of an unfortunate and decidedly posthumous byproduct of Thutmose's preparations for a smooth transition of power. After all, Thutmose would be aware of his own resume. He was a tough act to follow. His son and successor needed every advantage he could get. What looks rash to us at first glance now looks more calculating and pragmatic when considered in the context of the time. And here's something truly interesting about Thutmose. It seems that people only have good things to say about him. Most historical figures have a measure of controversy about them, or at least some debate about their legacy. So far as I can tell, no one has a bad thing to say about the guy. He was and is universally praised. With Sargon, the subject of our first episode, we discussed how hard it can be to separate the historical man from the subsequent mythologizing that swirls up around him. We have scant archaeological evidence. Even his capital city of a god is lost, one of the tantalizing mysteries of archaeology. With our friend Thutmose III, we have architectural evidence, preserved correspondence from other regional powers to Thutmose, statuary inscriptions, even his mummy. He just feels more tangible. His image is more in focus. Toward the start of the episode, I called Thutmose the very first pharaoh. Today, all kings of Egypt are referred to by that title. But for most of Egypt's history, the word, at least in terms of a regnal title, would have been meaningless. The rulers of Egypt took on elaborate regnal names and titles upon their accessions, most importantly to signify their divinity and their relationship with the gods. The word pharaoh is a modern derivative of an ancient Egypt word per-ah that means the great house. Thutmose III was the first king of Egypt to incorporate the term per-ah into his regnal title, thus the first pharaoh. So yeah, it's a bit of a technicality to say he was the first, but I don't think it's controversial to say that he was the best. He was Thutmose the Great. Thank you for listening to this episode. I sure hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're comfortable here in Egypt, because we're going to stick around for a bit longer. Join us next time when we meet the most famous Egyptian of all, see the spectacular collapse of Thutmose's 18th dynasty, and focus on another pharaoh with a big name, a big reputation, and a decidedly complicated legacy, Ramses II.